So I'm Merlin Crossley. I'm DVC academic and student life. I can see Rawdon, PVC Education's on the screen, and I can see that 55 people are here. People are still coming in. I'm on Gadigal and Wongal land, and today, so in inner west of Sydney, actually. And I welcome everyone who may be coming today and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever you are. So today we have a talk from one of my great colleagues, Alex Steel, who was acting PVC for a year and is now Director of Teaching Strategy. One of the things I think we're really fortunate to have, so I really am very concerned at the university about trying to minimize the gap between management and the people who are actually delivering all the hard and important work. And myself, Rawdon, Alex, people like Richard Buckland, Louise Lutzman, everyone in the Scientia Education Academy, everyone in the education-focused community, everyone. We want as many voices from people who actually know about teaching, the core business of the university, and to increase the influence that people have and to share best practice. Alex is an expert in criminal law, but he's also an expert in legal education. He's an enthusiast for new systems and techniques. Most of all, he's a great thinker and a great teacher. I saw a video of Alex from some years ago. He looks exactly the same age, but he has a COVID beard, which is very timely. And he's a great thinker. And I always look forward to these talks, and I'm looking forward to Alex's, because I know that I'll learn something and I know it'll stimulate a discussion. So I'll stop there now and let Alex take the floor. I haven't read out all his achievements, but he led the Scientia Education Academy and he's one of our most respected teachers, and I rely on Alex's insights a lot. Let's just, let me just say one thing finally. I am loving the chat. Please say things during the chat so that we can all engage with Alex's talk and as he goes through. And, you know, even though we're not all together in one room, that we can feel all together and thinking about the things. I hope Alex will be provocative. He's got, yeah, someone's doing a driving test on a desk. And I love driving tests and I love art prizes. It's a great title. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Merlin, and thank you all for coming. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm on at the uni at the moment on Bidjigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I do like the chat, although I don't think I can read it and talk at the same time, but everybody's already picked up the strangeness of this photo that I found on the web, where it looks like it's an exam hall, but there's no one there. And then there are two desks put together. And I just love the way that one of the things that we are really worried about is collusion in exams. And we think invigilated exams are possibly ways to limit collusion. But something went very, very wrong in the setup of this exam hall, because it looks as though it's designed for collusion in an invigilated setting. So I know no answer to that picture, but it's a good one. So I wanted to also admit that I'm not going to have answers for lots of things today. I'm really just going to have lots of questions, and it's the beginning. It's the first lecture for the year. So we're really trying to just sort of kick off some discussion about these things. And I wanted to also first acknowledge all the work the Academy did last year in terms of thinking about the future of assessment, and the work that's come out of Rawdon's area in terms of future of assessment as well. So there are a range of policy documents already sort of floating around, which are giving us some things to think about. So this is my sort of lightweight contribution to the issue. So let's start with 2019, which at the time we thought was a tough year. Things were horrible, but now I think we think of it as sort of Elysian fields, you know, autumn sunsets, everything was perfect. We had some issues with our assessment, but, you know, we would get around to fixing them. Things were going sort of okay. And then, of course, last year hit, and suddenly everything that we were doing with assessment was sort of exploded, and we had to start all over again. All of the certainties were gone. We've now sort of survived that, and we're in 2021, but I don't think we're certain as to whether or not the storm is finished. I've just mixed fire and water there in a terrible sort of bad analogy, and I'll continue with bad analogies all the way through. So, you know, has the storm gone? Is anything left? Are all the things that the huge amount of effort that we went through last year to build new approaches to assessment, were they worth it? Were they really the sorts of things that we needed to do? Can we keep doing them? Are they sustainable? All of those questions, which probably explain why everybody's come to the talk today. So there's a bad dad joke. It is probably time to reassess the way we're looking at things. And what I wanted to just sort of do today is sort of an overview, look at these sort of 4 areas. And they are, I would think probably most of you have already thought about this. And so in a sense, I'm aware of the fact that I'm possibly saying the obvious, but I just thought, let's put them all together into one big package and give us a way to think of it. So the first question is, who are we really assessing for? What are we assessing? What's different about doing it online? And what are the key things that we need to think about when we're trying to design assessment? So who are we assessing for? So the first possibility is that we are part of a grand institution with a long tradition. And the most important thing that we need to do in assessment is to make sure that we uphold the traditions and the reputation of the university. And there is a lot of fear when we have change that maybe we're undermining that. But I think one of the things we probably need to always remember is that if we are worried about protecting reputation, it's normally a conservative response. So we are trying to protect something from the past. Whereas if we are a university that aspires to be innovative and groundbreaking, then probably what we should be doing is we should be saying that traditional assessment patterns are just not acceptable for a university of our type. We want to be far more innovative, and we want to be brave, and we want to try and break the mold. And a lot of the things I'm going to say today I've picked up from other people over the last year or so. So plagiarizing quite broadly. But as someone said to me, why can't we be the most, if we were the bravest, strongest university in the world, we would say we don't need to assess. The fact that you came here and the fact that you came to our classes is a big enough badge for you to go out into the world and to be better than anybody else. So that's a really sort of extreme way of thinking about it, but maybe we don't need to be quite so defensive about our approach to assessment. And then there's the other really important thing we always have to think about, and that is that are we really doing the assessment for ourselves rather than for other people? So a lot of us went through university and did really well at university. A lot of us loved the way in which we studied. A lot of us have ideas of what ideal assessment practices would be that would suit us. And a lot of us want to reproduce those halcyon days in our classrooms. We really want to get back into that sort of great engaged approach to teaching and assessments that challenge us. But often we are thinking about the way in which we went through university. And back then, university was a small elite part of society. Now we are doing mass education, and there are different sort of needs in universities. So we always have to be very careful about whether we're doing it really for our own self-respect more than anything else. And then we have the employers. And this is sort of in the last sort of couple of decades, I think this has really come to the fore. So possibly when we were at university, and when I say we, I'm talking about the old crusty people, not the young sort of people who have just come through university. But if you think about the sort of the older, a couple of decades ago, employers were sort of not really on the map at all. Now there's a lot of sort of push for making sure that we are, as the government says, producing job-ready graduates. So assessment's all about employers. But if that's the case, then what is it that employers actually want? because although when we went through university, our grades were the most important thing to us because that gave us an academic career, most people in business will tell you that they survived university, the bits of it they can remember. The most important thing they remembered was probably not the stuff they studied for exams. It was what they did with the people at university. It's the broader work skills, people skills that they developed. So when we talk about assessment from an employer perspective, there's a completely different set of skills that come to the fore, and the academic skills that are so important to a lot of us may recede a bit to the back. But really, we should be doing this for the students. So assessment shouldn't be about us. It shouldn't be about the university. It shouldn't really even be about the employers. It should be about the students. What is it that the students need from assessment? So I've put across the bottom there the two key principles from the university assessment policy. And it's worth remembering that there is a university assessment policy. It has 5 principles, and of those 5 principles, 3 are about quality assurance. The 2 key ones are the first and the last, that assessment is designed to guide and enhance student learning, and assessment develops students' abilities to evaluate their own and peers' work. And the only way assessment can guide and enhance learning or help you to assess your own work is if you get feedback. If you're constantly assessed without any feedback, it's very, very hard to achieve those 2 goals. So what the assessment policy is really telling us is that assessment should be for learning, not of learning. So these sort of phrases are key, I think, to the way in which we think about assessment. And so then the next question comes to, well, what are we assessing, or how are we assessing? And this is where the title comes in, and we get to talk about the New South Wales driving test. And having a teenager who's just been through it, it's very sort of front of mind to me. So I love the driving test because of the fact that it's entirely pass-fail. You don't get grades. No one gets an HD for driving. They either get to drive, or we say you are too dangerous to be allowed in our roads. That's it. The only issue that counts. You can see the driving instructor there with his rubric. He's marking against a rubric because he's not judging for excellence or anything. He's just saying, did you get this all right? It's pass-fail, but it's not pass-fail in the way we understand pass-fail. It's 100% or 0 pass-fail with a little bit of leeway for 1 or 2 errors. So when we talk about pass-fail in a competency test, we don't talk about a range of marks. We talk about the fact that you actually can do the skill that you're asked to do. The other thing that's fun about it too is that there's a knowledge test, because you can't drive on the roads unless you actually understand what the road signs mean and so forth. And you would think that's a very important academic aspect of the driving test. And we would need to make sure that there's not a lot of cheating going on with that. So what the government does is it gives you a complete set of all questions that have ever been asked that are in the test bank. It gives you the answers, and it gives you practice versions. So if you really cared about this test, you could go and rote learn every single question and answer, irrespective of whether you understood it, and you could pass the test. So even though it's there as a test, we're not really worried about whether the students have really understood it. We just I think the government is basically saying, let's just point out to teenagers that there are rules, and you will. But the reason the test is important is because it's aligned to the final test, because you cannot pass the practical test if you misread the science. So that even though this test is at the beginning, it's a knowledge-based test, is actually core and linked to the final, if you like, capstone test. And the other great thing about it too is that it's invigilated. But if you know anybody who's been through the test, the invigilation involves an overworked RMS officer saying, could you go over there and sit in that booth and do it? And when you're finished, come back and tell me what your score was. So they are made to go in so that they understand it's a serious test, but the level of invigilation is really almost an honour code. If you really wanted to sneak in a mobile, you could. So that's a driving test. And then we have art prizes. So here's a winner of the Paddington Art Prize, which has been associated with UNSW and Ross Harley as part of the judging panel. The great thing about an art prize is there's no failure. No one fails an art prize. You enter it, and if you meet the criteria to enter, then you get displayed. but there's only one winner, or there's a couple of sort of commended runners up. It's all about excellence. We aren't caring about competence at all in an art prize. We're assuming that you are competent enough to actually do the artwork and enter the competition. So when we talk about art prizes, we are really talking about excellence only. We're not sort of worrying about whether or not they have the technique. And the other thing that's really interesting about art prizes, there's no rubrics. It's just it's exactly what the experts think. So you pick a panel, and then the whole point of picking the panel is then empowered to judge in any way they want to. So it's not a normal sort of assessment as we would understand it in a university. And the other thing too about plagiarism in art prizes is really fascinating. There isn't any attempt at all really to deal with issues of identity fraud and plagiarism. The Archibald Prize does not require any declaration apart from the fact that you're an Australian citizen. And I think the reason for that is because if you hung somebody else's painting in the Archibald, someone would see it. So because the assessment output is a public document and is seen by the public, it means that it's very hard to copy. So we do that in a sort of an internal way with things like Turnitin, where we sort of privately check against other published work. But if you think about sort of broader portfolio type assessments where things become public and everybody can see your work, then the level of plagiarism drops because of the fact that everybody can see what you've done. So then bringing that back to the university, how do we actually grade? So we're quite fixated on the idea that you give a mark from 0 to 100. And we get really quite sort of pernickety about where these grades go. But if this was a driving test, where would it be? So it would be there. But I don't think we really want people on our roads who got 51% in a driving test. But yet that's the way we grade. So we have a problem in our grading system. If we are testing competency, we're using the wrong way to grade it. So competency really should be pass-fail. The other issue too is the art prize aspect of it. If a student gets 84 out of 100, they feel devastated because what they really want is 85, because 85 is the HD, it's the badge which says I'm excellent. So our students become really fixated on the notion of getting badges for excellence based around name grades, when in theory what we're doing is a graduated scale from 0 to 100. So I think we're probably trying to do too many things in some of our grading schemes. So another way to get around that is to actually increase more courses or more assessments that are pass-fail, and say they are the competency tests. And in order to get through those, you've actually got to get more than 50%. You've actually got to show us that you can do it. And then have a couple of sort of marquee assessments where we say to the students, this isn't about you passing or failing, really. This is about you having a chance to demonstrate how good you are at something so that you can get a badge of excellence. And that can go into your e-portfolio. So that we have sort of a two-stream approach to student learning, which one is about assuring competence and the other one is rewarding excellence. And then a third approach to the way in which we think of degrees, and that is the notion of the black belt. And I know nothing at all about martial arts apart from what I've read on Wikipedia, so I'll say that at the beginning. But Wikipedia tells me that a black belt could be described as the bachelor's degree of martial arts, because it's the point at which you get all-round proficiency in the art. And if you think about what happens typically in a martial art leading to a black belt, there are coloured belts that you have to achieve before you get to the black belt. And there's a process of practice and support and feedback leading to this black belt qualification. But at the black belt qualification, it can be 5 or 6 hours of a whole series of tests that you have to go through in order to achieve your black belt. So if we wanted to translate that to a university context, here's my sort of terrible and badly proofread sort of diagram for how to do this. If we start off with a notion of, you've gone to the dojo, you're just starting to learn how to do your martial arts. This is sort of what's happening in the classroom. You are doing lots of little assessment tasks. You're getting feedback on it. It's formative, it's iterative. You are getting better and better at it. And then there's a point at which both you and your teachers think you are ready to go to your first belt. So you can go through that first hurdle. So these are competency hurdle assessments, which appear throughout the degree as points in which you can sort of tick off the box to say, yes, I can now do that skill and I can move on. And you could imagine the entire degree like that. And that already happens in some disciplines, for example, in medicine with their stage exams. So the idea is that you can practice and then you have to go and do your exam. The other thing that's really important about hurdle exams is that because they're pass-fail, you have to let people do them again and again. So you can't just say you get one chance at this. So we would have to rethink the whole sort of assessment processes around students retaking exams. But having said that, we already have a supplementary exam system. And if we properly prepared students for hurdle exams, then in fact, what would probably happen is the vast majority would pass. And obviously there's far less marking involved in the hurdle exam because it's really just ticking off a rubric to make sure the person has actually got to the level that's required of them. And then at the very end of this, you would have some sort of a capstone assessment where you would ask the student to do something complex that requires a whole series of other aspects that fit together. The other thing too is programmatic assessment, which is important and I think is really sort of emerging in lots of degrees. And that is that there are particular things that you do repeatedly throughout your degree. It might be a research skill, or it might be a presentation skill, it might be a practical skill in a lab. You don't do a subject on that, but when you actually get into the workplace, these are the things that are really key skills. So how do we actually manage to assure that students have actually achieved these skills? And the best way to do that is through programmatic assessment, where we pull out of those assessment tasks aspects that are relevant to the development of that skill, and students then sort of put money in the bank, if you like, in relation to those skills. And then that can all form part of an overall portfolio that the students can show to employers of, here are the skills that I did in these particular courses, and this is how I achieved my competence. That's obviously a highly complicated diagram, badly put together, but I think that the idea of that is to basically just throw out a bit of a thought experiment to say, rather than thinking of the university as a series of courses where you lead up to a final exam, you throw everything at it and then you forget everything, and then you start again in the next course in the next term, and then you start again like Groundhog Day all the way through your degree. To actually link all of these things, to remove the emphasis on these massive final exams and put the effort of the learning into the courses, so that at the end of the exam, it's more just a competency test. Can you show that all the stuff that you learned in that course can be, you can do that, so then you can move on to the next one. And also to link those courses on is probably a way for us to look forward in terms of assessment practices. Okay, so that's sort of the big generic stuff. So then the next question is, how does that translate to online? Okay, and no easy answers here, because we have spent decades, maybe centuries, thinking about exams as locked rooms, and that's the way in which you assess, and that's what real assessment is. So online assessment for high stakes is really reimagining the world, and I don't think anybody should assume that there's an easy, quick answer to this and that we will get it straight away. It will take us time. But there are some, and I'll just pick 3 or 4 things that I think are sort of big things that impact the way we think about assessment. So the first thing is that you have to assume that the students have got all the raw data. This is not an exam where you ask them to identify which of the following is the colour blue. They're going to be able to know that it's all going to be there. So what you have to do is you have to ask questions which require them to apply that data to problems. So actually exams become harder because exams become all about critical thinking. We assume that they either have memorized the information or, better still, know how to find it on Google. And now that the world relies so much on the internet for data storage and retention, it's sort of incredibly backward looking to think about learning as something which requires lots of memorization. There are some processes, obviously, that you need to know well and possibly memorize in order to do other processes at speed. And anybody sort of, you know, maths is a good example of that. There are basic approaches to analysing maths problems, which you need to be able to do incredibly quickly, because if you take too long to work them out, you will never get the time to finish the larger question that you've been set. So even though you might have an assessment where the students have access to huge amounts of information, they aren't going to be able to use that information if the question you're asking requires them to process that information in a time frame which doesn't allow them to go off and learn it for the first time in the exam situation. So we're not looking at memorization, but what we really do need to think about is making sure we're testing application. And then the other thing too is we shouldn't assume that the only thing a student has is a pencil or an abacus. We should assume that students have access to all of the tools that they would be using in business, and probably better tools than we've supplied through our own university systems. So we should let them use those research tools. It makes it a little trickier for us, obviously, to write assessments, because we have to think of things that are real messy problems for them to solve. But I don't think we can sort of, beyond possibly first year, assume that students are not going to have access to those tools, and we should think about building assessment that includes those tools. The other thing too is, if you get post paper in exams, you can add video or audio stimulus. This is a not particularly good example of one because it's an animation, but there are lots of things in the world that we have traditionally had to describe in words that, in fact, far more nuanced if you actually see them. So if you're asking somebody in a biology test to describe a particular flower, and you describe the flower in words, to identify a flower and you describe it in words, it would be far harder and far less useful than just showing them the picture of the flower and say, name the flower. So there are times where video or audio or photos are going to be much more authentic in the way in which you're assessing people than words. So online gives us that opportunity. And then the other thing, of course, is the fear of collusion. So what we need to do is, again, need to rethink, how do you actually set assessment tasks where you actually encourage that group discussion about things, but you require the students to write their own particular response, so that you can actually draw on the wisdom of the crowd, in a sense. And then the student has to use their own degree of critical thinking to work out whether or not what they're being told by their peers is actually right, and make a choice if there's a disagreement in the group. So whether it's giving people different tasks out of the same problem question, or assigning things differently, but we have to find a way to deal with this. So what I'm saying is there aren't necessarily straightforward answers that I can think of today for some of these issues, but this is the reality of online learning and online assessing, and these are the things that we really have to come to grips with. And then if we are doing video, then why are we making somebody write something and then mark it, then give it back to them and then give them feedback? Is there a way to actually incorporate a discussion about the student's work into the marking process, so that you could, for example, if you are asking a student to explain their learning in a Viva, you can mark it while you are listening to them. So at the moment that session is finished, there's no more marking to do. So dialogue sort of Viva type assessments don't necessarily involve more time than marking handwritten papers. So there are all sorts of options there. And of course, remember too, as I said at the beginning, there's the difference between the competency and the excellence approach. So if you're using Vivas for a competency approach, then you probably don't need to grade them more than, yes, this student understands the concepts, or no, the student doesn't understand the concepts. So it can be quite a quick process. But the other thing too to really remember is that the classroom is your best friend here as well. So that if we've got students back on campus, you can link assessments to what they're doing in class, and you can, through watching them in class, understand there's a huge amount of integrity measures you can build into your assessments, as long as You're linking stuff to in-class activities. You can do a lot of formative stuff in class, and a class, of course, if it's an interactive class, will really help to build a lot of community. So that will help to engage the students, and as the students are engaged, that will really diminish their impetus to cheat. So there's a whole lot of really powerful tools that we have in the way in which we run classrooms, which can help us to make our assessments more authentic and also make them more, give them more integrity. So here's sort of, if you like, sort of 5 quick questions for every convener. And they are all sort of motherhood statements, but I think the 5 questions really sort of raise the right sort of questions. So the first thing is, what was actually in your assessment last year? Not what was the assessment, but what was in it? So you set an essay, but what did you actually ask of the students in that essay? Or you set 50 multiple choice questions. What were you really after in those questions? What were they actually being asked? And then when you worked out what they actually were being asked, did you give them any feedback on it? What was the feedback they got that they could use from that assessment, and was it useful? Then why did you choose that assessment? Was that assessment something that was forced on you? If it was, why? What was the reasoning behind that particular assessment? Was it just the history of what the school does? And are you happy with that assessment? And even more importantly, do you think your students are happy with that assessment? And when you have the answers to all of those questions, then you know what works and you know what doesn't work, and you can really start to think about what needs to be done. So very quickly at the end, you can see I've run out of photos now. Here are some sort of ideas of some of the perspectives that we can think about when we're trying to redesign assessments. So the first perspective is to think about a learning outcomes perspective. So are you actually assessing something that's in the learning outcomes? If they're not in the learning outcomes, either you need to put them in the learning outcomes, or you need to stop assessing them. But you cannot assess something that's not in the learning outcome. So that's the first sort of editing process that everybody needs to go through, and quite regularly, I suspect. Are we evenly assessing the learning outcomes? So we have some learning outcomes which are sort of tacked on and no one really knows what to do with them. We really love the particular approach to assessment that we've done year after year after year, but it's really only honing in on 1 or 2 of those learning outcomes. So have we really taken our learning outcomes seriously? And how do they relate to the degree as a whole? So are some of the skills that we're assessing skills that have already been assessed in an earlier course, in which case we need to make sure that we're assessing them at a higher level than they were in the previous course to make it worth assessing again. Or if they haven't been assessed before and you know they're going to be assessed later, maybe this is the course for baby steps. This is the bit where you really put a lot of effort into helping the students succeed in that particular skill so that they're set up for success in later courses. And the really important one, what's the bare minimum? What is the absolute bare minimum that you need to assess the students? You don't need to assess them on everything. You need to encourage them to study everything, but the assessment could randomly be 2 or 3 topics out of the course, as long as the students understand and as long as it's sort of done fairly. But there is no need to assess and assess and assess. And often the things that are assessed in one course, as I said, are assessed in a later course. So maybe you don't need to do that. Maybe you could actually, and this works probably best in majors, work between courses to make sure that a particular skill is only assessed once, and that, and particularly if you explain to the students that they're required to understand what they learned in course A because they'll be asked about it in course B, then you'll get a huge amount more engagement in both courses and half the assessment. So there are, I think, clever ways to do this, but you've always got to remember the student perspective, and the student perspective has a big impact on what we do. So one of them is, how much is this assessment worth in my grade versus how much time do I have to spend on it? If you're asking someone to do something incredibly time intensive and it's only worth 10 marks, no one's going to do it properly. Everyone's going to be thinking, is there a way in which I can cut a corner here? Can I do this in another way? So the messages we send to students are really important about how important we think assessment is. And if the assessment is linked to a following activity, that's also another measure of importance. How easy is it to copy somebody else's answer? Because you don't want to make it easy. You don't want to create an environment where a student is being tempted, in a sense, to copy. So if you've got an assessment at home that's worth 30% of the grade, and it's 50 multiple choice, and the only thing you are doing is saying to the students, please don't copy from each other, there's going to be students who are copying, because if it's multiple choice, it's the same questions. In a sense, why wouldn't you? It requires somebody under stress to have enough moral fortitude to resist the temptation to cheat. And so we shouldn't be putting our students in harm's way by actually creating environments where we are tempting them to cheat. So we need to look at ways in which, instead of just clicking a button to produce an answer, we are making them do something else. So maybe they have to do some working that they have to upload to go along with the answer, or maybe they have to write a short reflection on why they chose that answer, or we're adding in things to make the answers slightly more individual than everybody else's. And as I said before, how many times has a student been assessed in this way? You don't want to ask them the same thing again and again and again, unless you have a learning outcome across the entire degree where you're trying to show the development of that skill through repetition. And that's entirely appropriate for the core skills in a program. But if it's not a core skill, then maybe mix it up with something else. Because the other thing that's really important is everybody is good at different things. So some people are fantastic at public speaking, some people are fantastic at writing essays, but you probably need to be able to write and speak in a job. So you need to mix the assessment up. And that needs to be looked at across the degree. Not in a course, you don't do it all in a course, but we need to find ways to make sure that courses all take the load for particular aspects of learning. And then this one's really important too. I mean, how does a student feel if they are required to do a high stakes assessment and they get no feedback? What message does that send to them about the extent to which this assessment is supposed to help them learn? So we need to make sure that when we ask things of students, we give something back. And the fundamental thing is, if I'm asking you to put all this effort into doing this assessment, I have to be willing as a teacher to give something back to them. Now, scale might mean that you can't sit down and spend all your time sort of taking them through it paragraph by paragraph, but there may be some broader way of doing it. So there may be sample answers, or there may be ways of providing whole of cohort feedback, but it's got to be meaningful and it's got to be helpful for students. How does it help them do better in their next assessment? And how does it stretch people? And I think the really important thing here is that you need to try to set assessments that adequately stretch students. So stuff that they think is a waste of their time is not going to help student engagement. Something that is far too difficult is not going to help student engagement. The difficulty, of course, is that when you've got a whole range of students with different abilities, this becomes possibly close to impossible. But still, it's an aim we should always think about. Are we setting an appropriate level of challenge for our students that will engage them but not deter them? And for students, any new piece of assessment needs to be bedded in. You can't just change assessment from one term to the next and expect the students to understand what's going on. Not only that, you may have taught this course 20 times, but the students have only ever done it once. So everything is brand new to them. And the hardest thing is trying to remember that even though we've done this assessment so many times, none of our students have, and we need to explain things. We need to make sure that there's a way for them to practice it. If it's a format they haven't used before, there needs to be some sort of feedback, and it could just be a generic sort of sample answer so they can see the sorts of things that are expected of them. But we just have to remember that they're a novice. They've never done this before, probably. They're not an expert at the format. Even though it's been done in previous courses, you can't assume that the teacher in the other course taught it the same way or marked it the same way. Even though there might have been a school memo that you're supposed to, you just can't assume that. So you have to explain it and explain it and explain it. And it doesn't matter how many times you explain it, there'll still be another question from a student. So we have to be incredibly open to explaining what we're asking of students. And then finally, Marcus' perspective, which I think is the one that really hits home to us a lot. If you're setting assessment for markers, what is it that you're actually wanting the marker to give marks for? And if you can work out from the beginning as you're designing the assessment exactly what marks you want to give the student, what you want the students to have marks for, then that should help to focus the nature of the assessment and the way in which the marking is done. So if you're only after 3 or 4 key things and you're asking them to write a long essay answer, then maybe don't ask for an essay response. Ask for short, targeted questions about those things. Look at ways in which you can use rubrics just to speed up marking. Look at the marking load across the degree. If you've got some courses which have got lots of automatic marking, then that means you've got staff there who have more capacity to help out marking in other courses. Now, this is obviously highly controversial, but there are people in courses who have designed their assessments so they don't have to do as much marking. And there are people in other courses who have spent a lot of time caring about their students who are being killed by the amount of marking that they're taking on. And so I think we need a whole of school, whole of degree approach to marking, so that we say the marking load and the teaching load need to almost be looked at separately to make sure that we are all sort of carrying the same sort of load in marking. And just to go back to what I said before, you don't need to assess everything. You can assume revision of everything, or you can require that, but only ask some things. So trying to think about, is this a competency test, in which case we probably don't need to worry about a range of grades. We just need to have competency and to remember that students have lives and they have other courses. So we have to be realistic about what we're asking. And then finally, this I think is just as important as anything else, that developing assessment is as important as developing curriculum. People spend huge amounts of time talking about what should be in the course, what topics should be covered, the way in which we should construct labs and those sorts of things. But we don't spend the same amount of time talking about how we should write our assessments. The amount of time that we should spend on assessment is arguably as important as the amount of time we should spend on developing curriculum. And because only a person who really understands the curriculum and how students have understood it as it's been taught can really write a good assessment task. So I may be slightly overstating this, but I actually think that good assessment is really a life work. It's not something you give somebody who's just turned up on their first day as the job that nobody else wants to do. It's the experts in the field who are the people who should be writing an assessment, the ones who really understand how the students learn and what we're trying to achieve. And we should recognise that. So the people in your course who write the assessments are in lots of ways the heroes, because they are the ones who are making sure our students succeed. They're making sure our standards are upheld and making sure that everything really hangs together in terms of the learning across the degree. So I think that's where I'll finish. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. And yeah, my head was spinning because you provoked the most energetic chat I have ever seen. And there are lots of good ideas. Look, I wonder, Rodden, are you still here? Do you want to manage questions? I'm not quite sure the best way to do it.
I'm happy for you to, Merlin, if you want to.
Okay, so let me just see. We're struggling because we're all missing some of the Teams things. What I think we could do, if people put up their hands, I will probably see it because I've got a list of everyone's things there, and then people can turn on their cameras and speak to Alex. I'll just say, Alex, it's great. That was the most provocative talk we've got. My initial summation is it won't be a one-size-fits-all, but we've got many options. And I also like the fact that it's a lot of work, and we have to, that it was acknowledged it's a lot of work, and we have to balance all that together. How to put a hand up on Zoom. You put, you have to do a reaction, don't you? What's the best way?
Bottom of the screen, reaction. Click on that and
reaction, and there's raise hand. So Louise, what's your question? You have the stage.
I think first of all, thanks so much, Alex. I think I always managed to pass the driving test, but I don't think I necessarily ever got even close to the art prize. But I loved you framing it in that way for us to think about, are we looking at competencies? Are we making sure that TEXA thinks that where degrees are appropriately accredited because our assessments are rigorous? And what does it do to help the students understand what we think is important? And I think that's, to me, what assessment really does, is it helps them know what we think is really important. So I'll pose the question I put in the chat, which is, if we're wanting students to think about things in a more complex way as they, and by the way, I love the competency and the hurdle tasks, because I think that just gives them the skill set. So I now have my toolbox. Now what can I do with my toolbox? And I know, I've got the tools in my toolbox because I passed the hurdle tasks. So now here's my toolbox. Louise, show me what you can build. Does that have to be an exam? Can that not be a 24-hour assignment where they have some more time to think? And we accept assignments as accessible tasks elsewhere. And I also love the idea that we give verbal feedback. There's so many questions I could ask. I'll stop there.
I think the simple answer is that the only reason we invented exams was it was the most efficient way for a marker to be able to give people a ranking. And it's probably the worst possible way to actually assess learning and to give feedback to students. So it's that sort of that golden cage of efficiency that David talked about, that we have created a system that we think actually delivers everything we need for the least possible cost, and it's very, very hard for us to let go of it. But I think with technology, there must be ways to assess students in more cumulative, low-stakes ways that still build to these sort of capstone approaches which don't require assessments, that lock someone in a room and take away their ability to access resources. I mean, you would never, ever in business hire somebody to work for you who said, all right, hang on, in order to answer your question, I'm going to lock myself in the toilet for 20 minutes and tell you the answer.
It's a good analogy. So it's good. So Gary Veland had his hand up, so we can go over to Gary. But yeah, we've locked ourselves in economically and by convention now, Alex. But this discussion's the first step to breaking out. Gary Veland.
Thanks, Merlin, and thanks, Alex, for a great presentation. Regarding the locking yourself in a toilet aspect, they might emerge flushed with success. But I was just going to say, in relation to Merlin's comment that this is a lot of work, I think I certainly agree that there is work and there will be expense involved in providing systems that support programmatic assessment and supporting students in their assessment and feedback literacy development. But I think this has become urgent from the UNSW perspective. Our quilt scores are not great, and as Rawdon will tell you, most of the negative comments are about assessment and feedback. So this is an area where we can make an impact, and we really do need to make a radical change.
That's right. Listening to our students, it's a real pain point, and yeah, so it's terrific. We do have to prioritize this, and Alex is thinking a lot about it, and so is everyone, and so is Robert Parker, whose hand's just gone up. Robert, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, look, Alex, thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it. I was wanting to ask you what you think about students writing their own assessment. In Moodle, there's a game that I wrote called the Reading Game, which effectively does this. The students, I've taken an assessment tool, which is a multi-choice question and a forum question, and turned it into a learning tool. So essentially the students are placed at the top of a taxonomy in terms of they have to have read the material or had some experience of the content of the course to actually write a question. Then they answer their own questions, and through a matter of game-based learning, they garden out the worst questions, and often lecturers use that to create, if you like, a formal assessment by pooling, exporting out the questions. But all the learning's happened in the game. It's a bit like any game. You know, if someone's done Fortnite for a month and, you know, got to the top level, you don't give them an exam at the end of it. They're basically already done the job. So what do you think generally about students participating in the creation of their own exams, and justifying, if you like, the questions they ask, which are accessible?
It's a great question, and I did a similar sort of thing in my course once, and I was really actually interested in using the learning game, but because my course wasn't large enough, I didn't think I'd get enough quality questions to the top. One of the things I found really interesting about that is, so the short answer is yes, the students should be writing their own assessments, because it's only, as we all know, it's only when you teach a course that you actually fully understand it. So if the students, we make them do presentations, and so often they do terrible presentations. Same sort of thing, when you ask them to write an exam question, they write a terrible exam question. And learning how to write the questions is almost as important, I think, as learning the answers, because you have to really understand the differences between aspects of the topic in order to write a question that differentiates it properly. So yeah, I completely agree. It's a huge task though, I think. But as Gary said, it's the sort of task we should take on. So yeah, having students write assessment questions, I think, is a fantastic idea. And again, it's that sort of competency thing. If they've gone through and worked out the answers to all of those questions before they got to the test, then we probably don't even need to mark it. They will have put all the effort in. The trouble is, if they think it's not going to be marked, they won't do it, or not all of them will do it. So you need a bit of a panopticon approach to make everybody think they're going to be marked. But you could probably walk away from assessments without marking them if the students are engaged enough in their preparation.
Thank you, Alex.
That's great. Thank you, Robert. So I think, yeah, some of these ideas, and we don't have to do it for every course. We can have pioneering courses that do this thing, and then it's often university management, the coalition of the willing, the opt-in is the way to spread ideas, evolution. I'd just say a simple thing about students doing their own, a course that I'm involved in, I won't say what it is, but they just got the students to do multiple choice questions and put them at the end of the lecture. And every student had to come up with a multiple choice question. I was stunned at how good they were and at how that exercise meant that the students kept up with the lectures. You'll be horrified that I still talk about multiple choice questions and I still talk about lectures, but it's a world I know. And it's working really well. And that's just such a simple little thing that works in the sort of science discipline I'm in. So now, who is there anyone else has comments? So there's been millions of comments and they're still coming in to the chat, but I'm looking if anyone wants to take the stage. So I also just say, I think we peaked at around 180 participants, which I don't know, but I almost feel that that's a record. And I'm really, again, I'm struggling with trying to work out the optimum way in the post-COVID world. Do we have these on Zoom again or Teams so we can give thumbs up to comments or not? Now, Rawdon, over to you. Your hand's up.
Thanks, Merlin. Thanks, Alex. That was really terrific. I loved every bit of that. It was brilliant. As you know, so I just wondered if you might just share a bit with everyone about how assessment can create artifacts that students have fun in creating and which they can carry through their careers beyond university, and which they can constantly reflect on, and how that can kind of bring UNSW really to the heart of lifelong learning. Just a small question.
Yeah, I know, and I suspect a very discipline-specific type question too. So, what is an artifact for each discipline will be quite different, and there are ways, there are incremental ways. Those of us who've had kids in high schools will tell you the horror stories of the badly put together ones where you have to do, one piece at a time every day for 6 weeks, and in the end it looks like a monster. But you can have those sort of assignments that build on skills that are all linked together, so that or you can have those sort of art prize ones where you say, all right, this is your final year, this is your major project, you're going to pull together all the stuff that you've done, and this is going to be the sort of the testament to what you learnt in this degree. And that's particularly in sort of art type degrees where you can have your major projects in third year, but you can do the same thing do the same thing in history and philosophy. You can have you can have major research essays that are at particular points in the curriculum, so that the students write that, and that remains as an artifact that they can keep and they can show employers. Because if an employer is asking you, what did you do? I mean, I think at the moment when an employer looks at a student coming at them from a university, they have a something called a WAM. They don't know what that is. They've got a whole series of numbers against names of courses. They don't know what was in that course. They don't know what that number means. There's a whole lot of misinformation that's in their head. There's a whole lot of overinterpretation that they're applying to that student's transcript. Because a student can say, okay, well, here's my transcript, and that will show you that I did well through uni. But here's the thing I'm most proud of. Here's the project I did. Here's a video of how I did it, or here's an essay I wrote. Then it's a way of saying to the employer, this is the best I can do, and this is what I can do for you, sort of thing. So I think there's a lot we can do with trying to make assessment outputs not things that get thrown away in the bin, but actually get kept and referred back to and then used as sort of markers of pride for achievement. It's
interesting. I think with the PhD, there is an artifact produced. There is, it's really just pass fail. Some universities have summa cum laude or something, but that's a good artifact. It's a good process. Fairly work intensive with the supervision, of course, and the scale of what we've done and the different pathways to degrees. Look, it's 12:57. I want to just invite Peter Heslin had his hand up, but that'll be the last question, and then we'll wrap up and go. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Merlin. Alex, thank you for a terrific presentation. It raises so many questions. Just one that's on my mind is, if we move to a world which is more about assessing incremental learning and maybe even a sort of a pass-fail sense, how are we going to deal with connecting what we give our students with broader stakeholders, for example, applying for Australian Postgraduate Awards or for other scholarships or studying at other universities, etc.? Might that be a sort of different assessment regime, or just any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, look, and the thing with all of these things is that the more you look at them, the more complex they get. But there's one of the other possibilities is that it's a question of how complicated a system you want, but you can have optional assessments where students who want a particular artifact that will help them, for example, if they want to go for an APA and they need a research paper and the degree is not really looking at research papers, to make sure that option is available for them so that they can actually do that assessment task and achieve that. But I think we've got to also be really, really careful that we're not atomizing assessment. So I think one of the key things about any notion of small-scale assessments and hurdles that are sort of pass-fail is that there's still at the end a capstone, that there's something that brings it together that is marked quite rigorously. And then that really becomes the way in which you can explain to the outside world that the student is competent across all of these areas, rather than having to sort of do a sort of a Lego approach to things. But getting the balance right there is really important too, because we don't want to create more assessment for students, and we don't want to create assessment that is stressful and overly burdensome. So we need to get the balance between the small scale, and it has to build you up to a level of competence so that you can then take on this highly integrated capstone type of assessment.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just had to find my unmute button. So look, that was terrific, Alex. I loved your pictures at the beginning. I loved the driving license and the art prize, the balance of competency and the excellence thing. I love the ideas in the chat. I love the fact 180 people came, and that's partly because we had a good speaker, but we always have good speakers. Thanks to everyone who's involved in this. We will keep working at it. And I think that it's not a one-size-fits-all. I think there needs to be insights from the experts in the different disciplines. I hope you found this interesting. And I hope we can give you the freedom to do things which are better, less onerous for the students, less onerous for our staff, but still deliver what the students need, which is sometimes motivation, a goal, a purpose, a credential, pride, as well as learning. So it's a complex space, but look, just thanks so much to everyone. And I've had to have a chat with Rod and Remy, you, Alex, Richard, Louise, everyone, SEA, about whether we do these online or face-to-face, because we've got to decide. But thanks everyone for coming today. And thank you again, Alex.
Bravo, Alex.
Thank you.